For centuries, history has repeated one strange pattern. The country that gains the most from a war is often the one that never sends a single soldier. While the world spent days watching American bombers, Iranian missiles, emergency meetings, and headlines predicting a wider Middle East conflict, another global power stayed unusually quiet. No dramatic speeches, no military intervention, no aircraft carriers rushing into battle. Yet when the first wave of the crisis began to settle, a different question started circulating among economists, diplomats, and geopolitical analysts. What if the biggest winner wasn't America and it wasn't Iran either? What if China quietly walked away with the greatest strategic advantage? At first, that sounds impossible. After all, China wasn't fighting. It wasn't dropping bombs. It wasn't dominating the headlines. But modern power isn't measured only by who wins battles. Sometimes it's measured by who controls trade, who secures energy, who strengthens alliances, and who convinces the rest of the world that they can remain calm while everyone else is reacting. This isn't a story about missiles. It isn't even a story about the Iran war itself. It's a story about how global power is changing and why the next chapter of international politics may be written not on the battlefield, but around negotiating tables, shipping routes, financial systems, and energy markets. Because by the end of this video, you'll understand why some experts believe the most important move in this entire crisis wasn't made in Washington or Tehran, but in Beijing. If you watch the headlines during the Iran conflict, the story seems simple. Missiles, airstrikes, military retaliation, breaking news every few hours. Every television network focused on the same question: who was winning on the battlefield? But geopolitical history has taught us something uncomfortable. Wars are rarely decided by what happens in the sky. They're often decided by what happens behind closed doors, inside financial markets, across shipping routes, and in the offices where governments quietly redraw their long-term strategies. Think back for a moment. After the Second World War, entire economies were transformed. During the Cold War, influence wasn't measured only by armies. It was measured by technology, trade, and alliances. Even more recently, conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan changed global energy markets, defense spending, and diplomatic relationships in ways that lasted far longer than the fighting itself. That's why many strategists don't ask who fired more missiles. They ask a completely different question: who emerged with stronger leverage once the shooting slowed down? And that's exactly where this story becomes interesting. While international attention remained fixed on military operations, another competition was unfolding almost unnoticed. Oil prices reacted within hours. Shipping companies began reassessing critical trade routes. Investors started calculating political risk. Governments quietly reviewed supply chains that stretched across the Middle East and Asia. These aren't dramatic moments that dominate television coverage, but they often determine who gains influence long after the headlines disappear. China understood long ago that global competition isn't only about military strength. It's also about economic resilience, access to resources, manufacturing capacity, and becoming indispensable to countries that suddenly find themselves living in a far more uncertain world. That doesn't automatically mean China won anything, but it does explain why so many analysts immediately shifted their attention away from the battlefield and toward the broader strategic consequences of the crisis. Because if a conflict changes how countries buy energy, who they trade with, who they trust, and where they invest, then the biggest geopolitical victory may have nothing to do with military casualties at all. Then that leads to an even bigger question. If China wasn't trying to win the war, what exactly was it trying to achieve? To answer that, we have to look years before the first missile was launched, because this story didn't begin with Iran. It began with a strategy that Beijing has been quietly building for decades. Long before the first missile crossed the sky over the Middle East, long before emergency meetings, military alerts, and breaking news banners filled television screens, Beijing was already working toward a very different objective: not preparing for a war, preparing for a world where economic influence matters more than military victories. For more than a decade, Chinese policymakers have invested heavily in one simple idea: if global trade becomes a center of power, then controlling the world's most important economic relationships may matter even more than controlling the battlefield. That's one reason China expanded major infrastructure projects across Asia, Africa, and parts of Europe. It strengthened energy partnerships with multiple countries. It diversified supply chains. It increased investment in manufacturing, technology, ports, and transportation networks. None of those decisions made front-page headlines every day. They weren't designed to. They were long-term moves, quiet moves, the kind that often attract very little attention until an international crisis suddenly changes the value of everything that has already been built. Think about how countries react during periods of uncertainty. Governments become more concerned about energy security. Businesses search for reliable suppliers. Investors begin asking which economies are better positioned to absorb global shocks. Every major conflict forces countries to rethink old assumptions. And every time that happens, influence can shift without a single new treaty being signed. This doesn't mean China controls the outcome. It doesn't mean Beijing wanted the crisis. But geopolitical competition isn't only about creating events. Sometimes it's about being prepared when events happen. That's an important distinction, because the countries that adapt the fastest often emerge with new opportunities that didn't exist before the crisis began. As global attention remained focused on military developments, Chinese officials continued emphasizing economic cooperation, regional trade, and long-term stability. Whether every country accepts that message is another question entirely. But from Beijing's perspective, projecting predictability, while others appeared consumed by confrontation, may itself strengthen its international image in some regions. And perception matters. In geopolitics, perception can influence investment, diplomacy, trade agreements, and even future alliances. Which brings us to something almost nobody was discussing while the headlines focused on missiles. Because if wars are also contests of economics, then the most important battlefield may not have been in the Middle East at all. It may have been the global energy market. And once you understand what happened there, the entire story starts to look very different. What made this crisis so important wasn't only what happened in the air, it was what happened underneath it. Because every missile that crossed the sky also sent a message through global markets. Within hours, governments weren't just monitoring military movements, they were monitoring oil prices. Shipping companies began reassessing some of the world's busiest trade routes. Insurance costs for commercial vessels started climbing. Energy traders suddenly found themselves asking a question they hadn't seriously considered for months. What happens if this conflict grows beyond Iran? That question alone was enough to shake financial markets, because the Middle East isn't just another region on the map. It sits at the center of one of the world's most important energy networks. Every day, millions of barrels of oil pass through narrow shipping lanes, connecting producers with customers across Asia, Europe, and beyond. If those routes become unstable, the consequences spread far beyond the countries directly involved in the fighting. Fuel prices rise, transportation becomes more expensive, manufacturing costs increase, inflation returns, and governments suddenly face economic pressure they never planned for. This is why experienced geopolitical analysts often pay just as much attention to energy markets as they do to military operations. Sometimes even more, because wars don't only change borders. They change prices, they change investment decisions, they change where countries buy their energy, and they change which nations become indispensable during periods of uncertainty. That's where China enters the picture again. Unlike many major economies, China has spent years trying to reduce its exposure to sudden external shocks. It has expanded strategic energy partnerships. It has invested heavily in infrastructure, connecting suppliers across multiple regions. And it has continued building long-term economic relationships designed to provide flexibility during periods of international instability. None of these policies guaranteed an advantage, but they did provide something every government values during a crisis: options. While other countries were reacting to rapidly changing events, Beijing already had years of planning behind many of its energy and trade policies. That doesn't eliminate risk. China still depends heavily on imported energy. Any major disruption in global shipping affects everyone. But preparing for uncertainty is very different from improvising during uncertainty. And that's an important distinction, because in geopolitics, countries rarely gain influence simply because someone else loses. They gain influence because they are better prepared for what comes next. As financial markets searched for stability, as governments reviewed emergency plans, and as businesses looked for reliable partners, a much larger question quietly emerged. If conflicts like this become more common, which country will the rest of the world increasingly depend on? That question may shape the next decade far more than the outcome of any single military operation. And once you begin looking at the crisis through that lens, something even more surprising starts to appear. Because this wasn't only about oil, it was also about something far more valuable in the 21st century: global influence. For several long seconds, neither of us moved. The tiny brass ring looked as though it had been waiting for someone's fingers. Not for years, for generations. My daughter looked at me. Mom, I don't think Grandma wanted anyone to find this. I slowly shook my head. No, I think she wanted the right person to find it. Very carefully, I slipped my finger through the little brass ring. The wooden panel resisted at first. Then, with a soft creak, it lifted. A small compartment appeared beneath the cedar wood, barely large enough to hold a few keepsakes. Inside, there wasn't money. There wasn't jewelry. There wasn't another letter. There was a tiny cloth pouch, cream-colored, hand-stitched, closed with faded blue thread. The very same thread my grandmother had wrapped around the letter. I looked at my daughter. Neither of us said a word. She simply nodded. I untied the thread. Inside the pouch rested a single gold wedding ring, very small, clearly handmade. Time had softened its shine, but engraved inside were two initials, asterisk, asterisk, EM. I frowned. Those aren't Grandpa's initials. My daughter whispered, they're not yours either. I turned the ring over in my hand. There was something else engraved, a date, asterisk, asterisk, April 18, 1949, asterisk, asterisk. My wedding had taken place almost 30 years later. This ring belonged to someone else, someone whose story had vanished. Then, folded beneath the ring, was one final piece of paper, much smaller than the letter, only a few lines, written by my grandmother. Had promised her that one day someone would remember she was loved. I felt tears filling my eyes. For all these years, this wasn't a hidden treasure. It was a promise my grandmother had quietly protected for decades. My daughter looked at me. So, who was Emma? I froze. Emma. Those initials. EM. For the first time, she had a name. Emma. I whispered it aloud. Emma. It felt strangely familiar, as though I'd heard it somewhere long ago. Then, like lightning, a forgotten memory returned. I was 8 years old, sitting beside my grandmother while she quilted. She had accidentally pricked her finger with a needle. A single drop of blood landed on the fabric. Without realizing, she quietly whispered, I'm sorry, Emma. At the time, I thought she was talking to herself. Now, I realized she had been talking to someone she'd never forgotten. I looked back at the tiny note. There was one sentence written beneath the promise, almost too faded to read. She asked me to give the ring to the bride who finally understood. Asterisk. I looked at my own wedding ring, then at Emma's, then back at the dress. Suddenly, I wasn't holding two different love stories anymore. I was holding one story, passed from one bride to another. Then my daughter noticed something tucked into the very bottom of the pouch, something neither of us had seen. A tiny old key, no larger than the tip of my thumb. Attached to it, a yellowed paper tag. On it, only 3 handwritten words. The sewing room. History has a habit of distracting us. It pulls our attention toward explosions, toward dramatic speeches, toward military maps covered in arrows and front lines. Those moments dominate headlines, but they rarely tell the whole story, because while cameras focus on what is happening today, governments are already planning for the next decade. And that may be exactly what separates short-term victories from long-term power. Every major geopolitical crisis forces countries to ask the same uncomfortable questions. Who can we really depend on? Where should we buy our energy? Which currency should we hold? Who will still be standing if another crisis begins tomorrow? These questions are rarely answered during the conflict itself. They are answered afterwards through investment, through diplomacy, through trade, and through thousands of decisions made quietly behind closed doors. That is why many geopolitical experts pay just as much attention to economic relationships as they do to military movements, because economies outlive wars, infrastructure outlives governments. Trade agreements often survive long after political leaders disappear. This is where China's long-term approach begins to attract attention. For years, Beijing has repeatedly spoken about building what it describes as a more interconnected global economy, not through military alliances alone, but through ports, railways, manufacturing, technology, financial cooperation, and long-term investment. Supporters argue this creates stability. Critics argue it expands Chinese influence. Either way, both sides agree on one thing. It is a strategy measured in decades, not news cycles. Meanwhile, many Western democracies operate under a very different political rhythm. Election cycles, public opinion, approval ratings, immediate political pressure. That doesn't make one system automatically better than the other, but it does mean their planning horizons are often very different. One government may be thinking about the next election. Another may be thinking about the next 20 years. And when international crises become more frequent, long-term planning can become a strategic advantage. This doesn't mean China will replace the United States tomorrow. Far from it. America remains the world's largest military power. It continues to lead in innovation across many sectors. Its financial markets remain among the most influential on Earth. Its alliance network is still unmatched. But global influence is no longer a winner-takes-all competition. The world is becoming more complex. More countries are trying to avoid depending entirely on one superpower. Instead, they are building relationships with multiple partners at the same time. That trend didn't begin with the Iran crisis, but crises like this accelerate it. Every conflict encourages governments to diversify risk, to reduce dependence, to create alternatives. And that slow shift may prove more important than any single military operation, because history often remembers the battles, but it is usually the economic decisions made afterward that shape the next generation. Which raises one final question. If the balance of global influence is already beginning to shift, what happens when the next international crisis arrives before the world has fully adapted to this one? When historians look back at major conflicts, they rarely ask who won the first battle. They ask something much bigger. Who emerged stronger after the world adjusted? That question is far more difficult to answer because wars create consequences that continue unfolding long after the shooting stops. New alliances appear, old partnerships weaken, supply chains move, investments change direction, governments rewrite national security strategies, and ordinary people often feel the economic impact years after the final headlines disappear. The recent Iran crisis may follow that same pattern. Military operations eventually come to an end. Diplomatic tensions gradually evolve. Markets stabilize. But the strategic questions remain. Will countries trust the same security arrangements they trusted before? Will energy buyers diversify their suppliers? Will businesses accelerate efforts to reduce geopolitical risk? Will governments continue building relationships with multiple major powers instead of relying on just one? Those decisions could shape international politics for years. And that is why focusing only on missiles risks missing the larger story. The battlefield was only one layer of this crisis. Another battle was taking place at the same time. A battle for credibility, for influence, for economic partnerships, for long-term strategic positioning. No missile can instantly win that battle. It is earned slowly through consistent diplomacy, reliable trade, economic resilience, technological innovation, and the confidence other countries place in your ability to remain stable during periods of uncertainty. That is why the biggest lesson from this crisis may not be about Iran at all. It may be about how the international system itself is changing. The world is becoming increasingly interconnected. Power is no longer measured only by military strength. Economic relationships matter. Technology matters. Energy security matters. Supply chains matter. Public perception matters. And perhaps more than anything else, preparation matters. Because countries that spend years preparing for uncertainty often respond very differently when uncertainty finally arrives. Does that mean China has already become the world's dominant power? No. There is no evidence to support such a simple conclusion. The United States remains one of the most powerful nations in history, with enormous military, economic, technological, and diplomatic capabilities. China continues expanding its global influence in important ways. Europe is investing heavily in its own strategic future. Regional powers are becoming more independent. The reality is far more complex than a single winner and a single loser. Perhaps that is the most important lesson of all. Modern geopolitics is no longer a game where one country wins everything and everyone else loses. It is a competition measured over decades, one investment at a time, one alliance at a time, one technological breakthrough at a time, one economic decision at a time. The Iran crisis may eventually be remembered not because it completely transformed the balance of power, but because it revealed a transformation that was already underway. A world where influence is becoming more distributed, more competitive, and far less predictable than it was only a generation ago. The next major international crisis will test these changes again. And when that day comes, the most important question may not be who fires the first missile. It may be who spent the previous decade quietly preparing for the future while everyone else was watching the headlines. If you enjoyed this analysis and want to follow the deeper forces shaping global politics, not just the daily headlines, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. Because the biggest stories are often the ones unfolding long before the world notices them.